The summer heat in St. Louis pressed down like an unspoken truth, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. The city buzzed with restless energy. Cars honking in clogged intersections, the distant wail of sirens slicing through humid air, and people moving through their daily routines with an edge sharpened by unseen tensions. For Darius Freeman, mornings began the same way. Black coffee, a quick glance at the news, and the quiet ritual of adjusting his tie in the cracked mirror of his modest apartment. But this morning felt heavier. The news was not just another headline. It was the beginning of something he could not yet name. Local man hospitalized after violent arrest. Police claim self-defense. A blurry cell phone video played beneath the bold letters. A black man on the ground, surrounded by officers. His face was bloodied, his hands raised in surrender before fists rained down. The clip was shaky, muffled by panicked voices of bystanders. The footage ended abruptly, leaving only questions and the familiar ache of déjà vu. Darius closed his laptop, his jaw clenched. He had seen this before, not just on screens but in courtrooms where justice was supposed to live. As a defense attorney at Henderson & Lowe, a small, black-owned firm fighting against the system's indifference, Darius had built a reputation for taking cases others avoided, cases that made people uncomfortable. But nothing had prepared him for Michael Cole's case. Later that morning, Darius sat across from Michael's sister, Ava Cole, in the firm's modest conference room. She was in her early 30s, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights but burning with fierce determination. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not from fear but from fury barely contained. "They nearly killed him," Ava whispered, sliding her phone across the table. The video played again, closer this time. Michael's face, bloody, bruised, filled the screen. His screams were faint under the officer's shouts. "Stop resisting." But there was no resistance, only survival instincts betrayed by his skin. Darius looked up, his heart heavy. "Has anyone from Internal Affairs contacted you?" Ava shook her head. "They're saying he attacked the officers. They're charging him with assault. But my brother's in a hospital bed, barely able to speak." The words settled like dust, suffocating in their cruelty. Darius nodded slowly. "I'll take the case." It was not just a decision. It was a line drawn in the sand. Leaving the office later that evening, Darius felt the city's weight differently. The sirens were louder, the stares from passing police cruisers more lingering. His phone buzzed with texts from friends warning him to be careful. But fear had no place in this fight. That night, in the dim light of his apartment, Darius stared at Michael's photo, a smiling black man, arms around his family at a barbecue. Not a suspect, not a threat, just a man whose life had been reduced to a headline. Darius closed his eyes, knowing the case would not just test the law. It would test him, and the system was about to push back. The following morning, the air in St. Louis was thick with the tension that never really left. A residue from protests past, from names that had become hashtags and then echoes. Darius Freeman stood outside the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, his suit crisp despite the heat, his face a mask of calm determination. But beneath it, the weight of what he was about to face settled deep in his chest. Inside, the sterile walls of the precinct seemed designed to drain the humanity from anyone who entered. Darius was here to meet with Detective Harold Briggs, the officer assigned to investigate Michael Cole's case. Briggs was a man whose reputation preceded him, decorated for his years of service but known for his aggressive policing style, especially in black neighborhoods. The interview room was cold, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. Briggs sat across from Darius, his badge glinting under the harsh light. His demeanor was casual, almost bored, as if another black man beaten by police was just paperwork on his desk. "I'm here about Michael Cole," Darius began, his tone steady. Briggs leaned back, folding his arms. "The guy who assaulted 2 officers? Yeah, I know the case." Darius's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I've seen the video. It tells a different story." Briggs smirked. "Videos never show the whole picture. People like to start recording after the suspect resists." "People like Michael," Darius thought but did not say. Instead, he replied, and officers like to yell, "Stop resisting," when there's no resistance. The tension was palpable. Briggs's smile faded, replaced by a hard glare. "Careful, counselor. You're not in court yet." Darius left the precinct knowing exactly what he was up against. A system that protected itself at all costs. Back at his office, he reviewed Michael's case file. The police report was a masterpiece of fiction. Claims that Michael had reached for an officer's weapon, that he was combative and threatening. There was no mention of the broken ribs, the fractured jaw, or the missing minutes in the body camera footage. When Darius visited Michael Cole in the hospital, the reality was even harder to face. Michael was a shadow of the man from the barbecue photo, his face swollen, stitches lining his temple, his eyes filled with both pain and fear. "I didn't do anything," Michael whispered, his voice raspy. "They pulled me over for a busted taillight. I gave them my license, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground." Darius nodded, his chest tightening. "We're going to fight this." But fighting meant more than legal arguments. The media had already spun the story, painting Michael as a repeat offender with a history of run-ins with the law, a narrative designed to justify his beating before a jury was ever seated. Darius knew that in cases like this, the truth was not enough. He needed proof, witnesses, and the courage to stand against a system built to silence men like Michael. He started with the body camera footage. The city's legal department dragged its feet, citing ongoing investigations. Weeks passed. Darius filed motions, faced delays, and encountered walls at every turn. But persistence paid off. When he finally received the footage, critical moments were missing, edited out, as if Michael's pain could be erased with the click of a button. "This isn't the full recording," Darius told Kendra Lawson, a fellow attorney at the firm, as they watched the choppy video. Kendra, sharp and relentless, leaned forward. "They're covering something up. We need to find out what." Their investigation led them to a witness, Luis Mendoza, a bystander who had captured the beating on his phone from a different angle. His footage showed what the body cameras conveniently missed. Michael on his knees, hands raised, before an officer slammed him to the pavement. Luis was hesitant to speak. "I've got kids," he said when Darius and Kendra met him in his small apartment. "I don't want trouble with the police." Darius understood the fear, but he also knew the power of truth. If you stay silent, they win. Michael's life matters. Your voice matters. Luis nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll testify." The trial date approached, and with it came threats. Darius received anonymous calls, silent at first, then whispers. Drop the case. His car's tires were slashed outside his apartment. Notes slid under his office door warned, "You're next." But fear was not new to Darius. He had grown up in St. Louis, knowing the difference between sirens meant to save and sirens meant to silence. He carried that knowledge like armor. One evening, as he prepared for court, Darius received a visit from Captain Raymond Stokes, a high-ranking officer with political connections. Stokes sat in Darius's office, his smile thin and insincere. "You're a smart man, Freeman," Stokes began. "This case, it's not worth your career. Let it go. Take the deal the DA's offering." Darius met his gaze, unflinching. Michael didn't commit a crime. The people who put him in that hospital did. Stokes's smile faded. "Be careful, counselor. Sometimes justice has a price." When Stokes left, the silence in the office felt louder than his words. But Darius knew one thing for certain. If justice had a price, he was willing to pay it. The night before the trial, Darius stood alone in his apartment, staring at the photo of Michael smiling with his family. He thought of his own father, a man who had been stopped, questioned, and humiliated more times than Darius could count. Never arrested, but always reminded of where he stood. This case was more than legal strategy. It was history repeating itself unless someone stood in its way. And Darius was done sitting down. The morning of the trial arrived with a gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the mood inside the St. Louis County Courthouse. The towering stone building stood like an unyielding monument to a justice system that had failed too many. Inside, the hallways buzzed with the quiet murmur of voices, footsteps echoing against polished floors, and the faint scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. Darius Freeman adjusted his tie in the reflective glass of the courtroom door, his face calm but his heart steady with purpose. He had prepared for this moment, not just with legal briefs and exhibits, but with the quiet resolve of a man who understood that justice was rarely served without resistance. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters clustered at the back, their notepads ready, cameras flashing sporadically. On the prosecution side sat Officer Derek Vance and Officer Thomas Reed, the two men responsible for beating Michael Cole nearly to death. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces stoic, as if they were the victims. Michael sat beside Darius, his face still marked with faint scars from the attack, his body language tense but hopeful. His sister, Ava Cole, sat behind them, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecutor painted Michael as an aggressor, describing him as non-compliant and hostile, using language carefully crafted to dehumanize without saying the quiet part out loud. When it was Darius's turn, he stood slowly, walking to the center of the courtroom. He paused, letting the silence settle. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady but firm. "This case is not about a broken taillight. It's not about resisting arrest. It's about accountability. It's about a man who was beaten within an inch of his life for the crime of being black and breathing." The room grew still, the weight of his words pressing down like gravity. He continued, "You'll hear stories designed to justify brutality. You'll see edited footage meant to protect the guilty. But today, you'll also see the truth, because Michael Cole deserves to be seen, not as a suspect, but as a human being." Testimonies began. The prosecution called Officer Vance first. On the stand, he recited his rehearsed narrative. "Mr. Cole was aggressive. He reached for my partner's weapon. We used necessary force to protect ourselves." Darius approached, his expression neutral but his mind sharp. "Officer Vance, you claim Mr. Cole reached for a weapon. Did your body camera capture that moment?" Vance hesitated. "The footage was obstructed during the struggle." Darius nodded, pacing slowly. "Convenient. But we have another angle, don't we?" He clicked the remote, and Luis Mendoza's video appeared on the large screen. The footage played in silence, save for the quiet gasps from the jury. Michael was on his knees, hands raised, before Vance slammed him to the ground. The beating unfolded in brutal clarity. No weapon, no threat, just rage disguised as law enforcement. Darius let the silence linger after the video ended. Then he turned to Vance. "Where's the struggle, officer? Where's the weapon?" Vance shifted uncomfortably, his facade cracking. "The video doesn't show everything, but it shows enough, doesn't it?" The jury watched closely, their expressions harder to read now. Next, Darius called Luis Mendoza to the stand. Luis was nervous but resolute. He described what he saw that day, his voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. "I saw Michael with his hands up. He wasn't fighting. They just started hitting him." The prosecutor tried to discredit Luis, questioning his character, implying bias. But Darius was ready. "Mr. Mendoza," he asked gently, "do you have any connection to Michael Cole?"
No.
"Did you have any reason to lie under oath today?"
No.
Darius turned to the jury. Sometimes the truth doesn't come from those in uniform. Sometimes it comes from the people who refuse to look away. As the trial progressed, Darius noticed the shifts, the tension in the officers' testimonies, the cracks in the prosecution's case. But the fight was far from over. The defense for the officers played on every stereotype imaginable. They highlighted Michael's prior arrests, none violent, but enough to paint a picture they hoped would stick. They questioned his character, his choices, everything but the actual crime committed against him. Darius knew the real trial wasn't just happening in that courtroom. It was happening in the hearts and minds of the jury, shaped by biases the law pretended didn't exist. When Michael took the stand, the room grew silent. His voice was soft but clear as he recounted the night he was beaten. "I was scared," he said, "not because I did anything wrong, but because I knew they could do anything to me, and no one would believe me." Darius stood, his voice quieter now. "Michael, when you had your hands up, what were you thinking?" Michael's eyes glistened. "I was thinking, I hope I survive." After Michael's testimony, the The prosecution rested, their case built on broken logic and the hope that uniforms would outweigh the truth. Darius prepared for his closing argument, standing in front of the jury, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "This isn't just about Michael Cole," he began. "It's about what we accept as justice. You've seen the videos. You've heard the testimony. Ask yourselves, if Michael looked different, would he be here today? Would we even be having this trial?" He paused, letting the question settle. Justice isn't about protecting the powerful. It's about protecting the truth. And today, the truth is in your hands. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like days. Darius sat beside Michael and Ava, their hands clenched, hope and fear intertwined. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The foreperson stood, unfolding the verdict form. Darius held his breath. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent as the jury foreperson stood, the crisp sound of unfolding paper echoing louder than the faint hum of the air conditioner. Darius Freeman felt the weight of every heartbeat in the room, each one a drumbeat of anticipation, fear, and fragile hope. The judge's voice was steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, glancing nervously at the defendants, Officer Derek Vance and Officer Thomas Reed, before shifting her gaze to Michael Cole, who sat quietly beside Darius. Michael's hands trembled slightly on his lap, his sister Ava gripping them tightly, her jaw clenched. "In the case of the state of Missouri versus Derek Vance and Thomas Reed, on the charge of aggravated assault, how do you find the defendants?" A pause. A breath. "Guilty." Gasps filled the courtroom, some in shock, others in quiet relief. Darius felt a surge of emotion rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. It was not just about this verdict. It was about what it meant. The judge continued as the verdict was read for the other charges: misconduct in public office, falsification of reports. Guilty. Each word felt like a stone placed on the fragile foundation of justice, finally adding weight where it belonged. Officer Vance's face remained stoic, but his clenched jaw betrayed the defeat burning beneath. Officer Reed looked down, avoiding the stares from the gallery. Darius glanced at Michael, whose eyes brimmed with tears, not of sadness, but the complex release of fear, anger, and gratitude tangled into one. Ava sobbed quietly, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with the relief she had fought so long to feel. The judge ordered both officers to be remanded into custody until sentencing, a rare move in cases like this. Darius knew it was not just symbolic. It was accountability, even if delayed. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Activists, supporters, reporters, and strangers who had followed the case closely. The media frenzy began immediately, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward. Darius stood at the courthouse steps, the city's skyline hazy behind him, a sea of faces looking up with anticipation. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying over the noise. This verdict is not the end of the fight. It's a step, a necessary one, in a system that too often protects power instead of people. Michael Cole deserved justice, and today, he got it. But there are countless others whose names we do not know, whose stories never made the news. This verdict is for them, too. The crowd erupted in applause mixed with tears. But behind the noise, Darius knew the truth. Justice was a battle, not a victory lap. In the weeks following the trial, life did not magically return to normal. Michael's physical scars began to heal, but the emotional ones remained. He attended therapy, supported by Ava and the community that had rallied behind him. His name was no longer just tied to trauma. It was tied to resilience. For Darius, the case had changed him. One evening, he sat alone in his office at Henderson and Lowe, staring at a framed photo on his desk, not of the courthouse or the trial, but of his father, a man who had never seen justice served for the indignities he endured in his own life. Darius thought about the countless hours spent preparing for the case, the threats, the moments of doubt. But most of all, he thought about what it meant to stand up when the world expected you to sit down. His phone buzzed, a message from Luis Mendoza, the witness whose courage had helped turn the case. "Thank you for believing in the truth when it was easier not to." Darius smiled softly. It was not about belief. It was about refusing to look away. Weeks later, during the officer's sentencing, the courtroom was filled again. The judge's words echoed like a final chapter closing on a long, painful book. Accountability is not vengeance, the judge said. It is the foundation of trust between a community and its law enforcement. When that trust is broken, it is not just an individual who suffers, but the very fabric of society. Both officers received significant prison sentences, uncommon, but fitting. It was not perfect justice, but it was something. After the hearing, Darius walked out into the crisp fall air, the city quieter than usual. He looked up at the sky, gray, but not as heavy as before. Ava approached him, her eyes softer now, filled with gratitude. "You saved my brother's life," she said quietly. Darius shook his head. "No, he saved his own. I just made sure the world saw it." She nodded, tears welling up again. "Thank you, Darius, for everything." As she walked away, Darius felt a peace he had not known before. Not because the system was fixed, but because he had fought to bend it, even slightly, toward what was right. He knew there would be more cases, more names, more battles. But for now, he allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. Not victory, just justice. Months after the verdict, the city of St. Louis moved on, as cities often do. Headlines faded, news cycles shifted, and the world's attention drifted elsewhere. But for Darius Freeman, the echoes of the trial lingered like faint footsteps in the back of his mind, reminders that justice was never a destination, just a momentary pause in an ongoing fight. On a crisp spring morning, Darius found himself standing before a small crowd gathered at a community center in North St. Louis. The space was filled with young law students, activists, and local residents, people hungry for change, for answers, for hope. The event was simple, a legal forum on police accountability. But for Darius, it felt like something more, a continuation of the work, even after the courtroom lights had dimmed. He adjusted the microphone, his reflection faint in the glass doors behind him. His voice, steady and clear, carried through the room. "When I stood in that courtroom fighting for Michael Cole, people asked me if I believed we'd win," he began, scanning the faces before him. "But the truth is, winning was never the goal. The goal was to make sure the system couldn't look away. Not this time." The room fell silent, every ear tuned to his words. "Justice isn't a verdict," he continued. "It's not a headline or a trending topic. Justice is what happens after the cameras are gone, when the system thinks it can go back to business as usual. It's in the cases that don't make the news, in the names we never hear." He paused, thinking of Michael, who was slowly rebuilding his life, and Ava, who had turned her grief into activism, organizing community workshops on legal rights. "I won't stand here and tell you that the system is fixed," Darius said, "because it's not. But every time we fight, every time we refuse to be silent, we push the line a little further. And that's what matters." Applause filled the room, not thunderous, but sincere. After the event, as people trickled out, a young law student approached him, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. "Mr. Freeman," she said, her voice a mixture of nerves and admiration, "I want to be a lawyer because of people like you. How do you keep going when it feels like the system's too big to change?" Darius smiled softly, his thoughts drifting to the nights he had sat alone, wondering the same thing. "You remember why you started," he replied, "and you never forget who you're fighting for." As he left the community center, the city stretched out before him, its streets worn, its people resilient, its flaws exposed but not untouchable. The fight was far from over, but Darius Freeman was ready, and that was enough.